Good evening, everybody. My name is Joe Manning, professor of classics and history here at Yale, and it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker this year. We are running like a Swiss watch because we're on a bit of a tight time schedule tonight. There's another event coming in here just around 6. So we're going to have the lecture, and we're going to have questions, I think, at the reception, to which you are all invited at 6:30 at Union League, I think on the second floor. And then tomorrow morning during John's seminar. So we invite questions, comments either tonight at the reception or tomorrow morning, if that's okay with everyone. We're going to try to keep to this schedule because the main event is, I think, more important tonight. Mikhail Rostovtzeff came to Yale from Madison, Wisconsin, being named the Sterling Professor of Ancient History and Archaeology in the same year, 1925. He brought with him a fierce reputation. Students at Madison and his lectures were packed. It's one of my dreams, to have packed out ancient history lectures always. The students at Madison, the undergraduates, called him Professor Rough Stuff, which is an approximation of his name, but it's something it's so endearing. And if you want to know more, I think Glenn Bowersock's essay in The American Scholar makes for wonderful reading of Rostovtzeff's Madison years. Although it's monumental, The Social and Economic History of the Hellenistic World, 1941, is still his most important work. His views on Hellenistic culture are clearest, I think, in his discussion of the material excavated at Dura Europos, which is housed here at Yale. He served as president of the American Historical Association in 1935, something only one other ancient historian before him had done, the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, who served in 1928. His work is still widely read by ancient historians, especially those who concentrate on the Hellenistic world and the Roman Empire, of course. Even though his interpretive framework, so strongly influenced by his own life experiences, has been increasingly challenged. While there's been good work on his life by Marinus Vess and others, Rostovtzeff's career has still not received a comprehensive study. Maybe someday. He has that sort of giant career, I think. Visiting his grave this afternoon with a group of us, which we do every year, I turned to thinking, as I often do about Rostovtzeff, to what would Rostovtzeff be doing now, were he still with us as professor of ancient history and archaeology? I think he'd be very interested, indeed, in tonight's speaker. Born in 1968 in New York City of Chinese immigrant parents, John Ma grew up in Geneva, Switzerland, where he was schooled at the Collège Calvin in a traditional European way, in the classics, namely Greek and Latin, to be proficient in the languages and to be able to read literary texts. Independently, he developed an interest in ancient history and archaeology. While still in school, he audited courses at the University of Geneva and worked even as a volunteer excavator on archaeological digs in France. He developed his interest in classics and specifically in ancient history at Oxford, where he studied in the traditional course in that discipline, Literae Humaniores. I won't get the dates. He began graduate studies on an Andrew Mellon Fellowship in the Humanities held at Princeton University, where he furthered his interest in Greek history with Josh Ober. In 1992, he was elected as a prize fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. At Oxford, he completed the doctorate at D.Phil in 1997, under the supervision of the Camden Professor of Ancient History, Fergus Miller, specializing in Greek epigraphy and Hellenistic history. He also spent time in Hamburg to work with Peter Hermann, then retired from the University of Hamburg, and Christian Habicht at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, who was a visiting professor in Hamburg that same year. Both important figures, of course, in the field of Hellenistic history and Greek epigraphy. His dissertation, Antiochus III and the Cities of Western Asia Minor, appeared in 1997. It received the Connington Prize, and it remains a classic in the field. After his dissertation, he was appointed as assistant professor in the Department of Classics at Princeton. During this period, he held a visiting appointment also, the Directeur d'études invité at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. In 2001, shortly thereafter, he was elected as a tutorial fellow at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and a university lectureship in the Faculty of Classics. He held this position until 2017, teaching ancient history at graduate and undergraduate levels. During this time at Oxford, he held a visiting appointment at the École Normale Supérieure, Rudum, and I always feel we have to say Rudum in hushed tone. It has that reputation in academia, of course. What a place. In 2015, he took up a professorship of classics in Columbia, where he is currently employed. He served as chair of the department for 5 years, and he's actually continuing his 6th year. And I hope not too much longer, John. For all of our sakes. He has ranged widely within the field of expertise, his own field of expertise, Hellenistic history, of course, by looking at epigraphy, geography, visual evidence, very broadly. He's also tried to create, beyond that, connections and conversation within ancient history and with adjacent fields. An achievement that I know he's very proud of is having been principal investigator on a research network grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK from June 2010 to June 2011. Directed in collaboration with C.J. Tupland at Liverpool, this large grant allowed for a whole array of research activities centered on the private correspondence of Arshama, the Persian satrap of Egypt in the 5th century BC. Activities during this year included a year of instruction in Aramaic with a specialist, Dr. D. Taylor at Oxford, an exhibition in the Bodleian, and 5 international workshops, 5, incredible, grouping specialists from the US, UK, France, Germany, Holland, and Israel in classical history, biblical history, the ancient Near East, Semitic languages, texts, archaeology, art history. Quite a range of subjects. Quite a year, John. The findings of the Arshama project were published after 10 years of work, Arshama and His World, the Bodleian Letters, in Context, 3 volumes, Oxford 2021, and they are magnificent volumes. I use them myself. I taught from them. They're incredible. Not bad for a side gig, John, I would say. His most recent book, I'm sure many of you know, is Polis, Biography of a Political and Social Form. It's gigantic. I can't wait to read it, maybe over the holidays. That'll be my project. Came out in Princeton University Press 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm thrilled to introduce you to my friend, Professor John Ma, speaking tonight to us about timber, textiles, tax and trade, economy and society in Hellenistic Ionia. John.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction. In March 1997, I visited Urla, a village in western Turkey near Urla, Izmir, looking for a famous inscription which was nothing less than the birth act of capitalism. Actually, that's not true at all. I was just saying this to big up this inscription because I felt embarrassed that I'm just talking about a single inscription in spite of the enormous honor that is done to me by this invitation to give the Rostovtzeff lecture. It's still quite an interesting inscription. It's on your handout. It was found in 1887 by Franz Winter and Walter Judeich at the end of the Reisestipendium. It concerns a takeover by one polis, by Theos, here, of another unnamed and therefore not located smaller polis. The name now lost because of the fragmentary state of the stone. What is preserved is the end of this document, this Synoikism document of the type studied by notably Gary Rieger. The end of the document, a fragmentary clause of unclear import, and 21 lines on our favorite subject, taxation. So please allow me just to read my translation, which Jess very kindly weeded of its typos, so it's actually perfectly good as a reading copy, and you have the text and Christophe Chandezon's notes. So it starts saying something like partaking of the things of which the other Teians partake, seeing that over 4 years, something of taxes. And now the bit begins that we can more or less make sense of. Let them, the citizens of the city being annexed or taken over, be free of choregiai, obligation to provide a chorus, of something here, of boegiai, providing oxen for sacrifices, of lampadarchiai, or this is providing, of course, teams of torch racers at festivals, and let them be free of the levy, the epigraphe, on the oxen, ploughing ones, as many as they have, and spare oxen. And let let the working oxen be free of the works which the city executes, if that's a correct restoration. Let there be given to them freedom of taxes on the yoke beasts, the hypodzygia, that means mules or donkeys, and the something, probably the slaves, both those hired out for pay and those which gather wood, and on anything else which they work or sell in relation to wood selling, xulopolie. And they let them be given freedom of taxes on sheep, very important, and let it be possible for those who wish to raise pigs to the number set for the sheep. Let them be free of all other taxes except the medical tax, the iatrikon. As concerns whichever of the slaves sells, probably charcoal, that's a restoration by Adolf Wilhelm, a very good one, sells charcoal or whatever else relates to wood selling, let them have ateleia, freedom of taxes for them. And whoever makes small cloaks, klandia, or something, or something else out of wool, Milesian or rough or soft, if that's a correct interpretation, let them be exempt from taxes, both selling there and exporting. And whatever, not he, but they import for the work of the small cloaks and something, purple dyeing, let them have freedom of taxes for all these things. Afterwards, more freedom of taxes, on gardens and beehives. And then this final clause, let them have freedom of taxes on all if they wish to export. Well, that's this document, this fragmentary document about taxes. And I'm going to try to argue that it is a fascinating piece of social history. So if you'll indulge me for 50 minutes about a tax document, a document on tax holiday and tax relief. The fine spot, so here's the inscription, which used to be in the cemetery of Ulamush, now is at Teos in the excavation site, because of course the fine spot of the excavation, Ulamush here, and the foothills of the Kızıl Dağ, is not an ancient site. The inscription probably traveled from the urban site of Teos, near Seljuk, right, near modern Seljuk, a city which, of course, has been the object of much antiquarian and then scholarly inquiry on account of its fame, but also its easy accessibility. Equally important, the city's territory. Here's Teos here on its peninsula. The city's territory has been extensively studied with a coastal plain, a mountainous hinterland, and then some kind of communication with the neck of the rough and rugged Erythraia or Urla Peninsula. So this is a very interesting inscription. It contributes to three major themes in Hellenistic history. The first is the agency of the local communities. Teos in our text seems to be free from external and especially royal control. It's embarking on a policy of expansion by annexing one of its neighbors, as documented in another probably contemporary text published by the Robert. Teos took over another city, Kirvisos, probably a city in the mountainous hinterland. Both events showing the autonomy and initiative of one city during the crucial formative period between, say, 334 and 281, studied recently by Laurent Cadotret in his monograph on the laboratory of the Hellenistic age. The second theme, of course, is that of fiscality. The text from Ulamush provides at least a partial roster of local taxation. It's often used in studies of the finances of the Greek cities, for instance, in the massive survey by Leopold Mijot. The diversity of financial resources is striking and deserves close attention. Leiturgia, so voluntary payments by members of the elite, levies, corvées, at least on oxen, indirect taxes on production, direct taxes, including a medical tax, and various other interesting taxes on production. The third theme, of course, is that of economic life. The list of tax exemptions gives some sort of conspectus of the various economic activities in this nameless city. And Rostovtzeff duly read the document to imagine a small community of well-to-do bourgeois who derive their main income from the intense cultivation of their land and, in a subsidiary degree, from some industries. This is a wonderful sentence which combines several Rostovtzevian obsessions: bourgeoisie, industry, and of course the land. No facile modernist he. In the first version of this lecture, I tried to cover all three topics: autonomy, taxation, and the economy, with the predictable disastrous results of length and superficiality. In what follows, and I'm very sorry to disappoint aficionados of early Hellenistic chronology and of Ptolemaic terminology for indirect taxation, I will focus on the third theme, on the economy. I'll just mention very briefly, perhaps for our seminar tomorrow, that one of the reasons this text is interesting is that it shows that window of autonomy before 312 BCE, before the age of Antigonos, and second, because this text may, in fact, well, an interesting thing to study about this text is the intuition of the Greek economist Andreas Andreades, economist and man about town, politician, theatre critic, and historian, that the taxes in the Ulamush text are partly Achaemenid survivals, satrapal survivals, which the city keeps on collecting even after 334, which I think is an extremely interesting idea, even if Rostovtzeff tried to argue against it. And that we know now more than Rostovtzeff did. I think Andreades' intuition is actually quite an interesting one. So I want to look at the third theme, the economic life of the early Hellenistic world between timber, textile, and trade. So back to Rostovtzeff, who not only read this Ulamush text, this text from Ulamush, but also combined it with another famous document from Theos, the letter of Antigonos Monophthalmos about Sinoikism between Theos and Lebedos, to provide a rosy picture. The citizens live a narrow life within their territory, consuming mainly their own products. Occasionally, they export some of these, but more often, especially when crops fail, they are in urgent need of imported food. This picture needs revising, not because it's primitivist or modernist, but because there's a basic flaw, which is that Rostovtzeff is combining the picture from the Ulamush text, which does not concern Theos, with the evidence for Theos proper. So the first question is, in fact, which is this smaller, nameless community which is being absorbed? Where is it in the region? Now, because of the fine spot, Ulamush, which is, where is it? It should be about here, right? In the foothills of the mass of the Kızıldağ turned into the famous two brothers on the Gulf of Izmir. Because of the fine spot, the Roberts thought the city was probably somewhere in the Kızıldağ, in this great limestone massif in the hinterland of Theos, a small mountain polis living off its resources in wood and pasture. And indeed, the text can be read this way, and Christophe Chandezon followed that interpretation. The only problem is that the text seems to mention purple dyeing. So the purple dye would have had to be transported up into the mountains. Not impossible. Recent experiments by notably the German artist Inge Canold shows that the relevant type of shellfish can be preserved in honey, for instance, and transported. But this still is a bit of a problem. Nonetheless, the model would have been comparable to that of Aigai, big polis, and Olympos, smaller polis, in the mountain, of course, economically joined, a union which leads to this synoikism, this actual formal annexation of the small polis by the big polis. Recently, the Turkish historian Mustafa Adak, who's the epigraphist on Teos, suggested that the city that's being annexed is Airai, a small Ionian city across the bay of Teos. It's a very, very shrewd idea because it avoids multiplying synoikism in the region, since we know that Airai was indeed absorbed by Teos. There's a paleographically contemporary document to the Ulamush text which shows that in a arbitration between Colophon, Erythrae, Klazomenai, and Teos, Airai doesn't appear. Or sorry, the Airaioi, the cities in Airai don't appear, it just appears as a toponym, and therefore Airai was absorbed around the same time as the Ulamush text. The site of Airai is a village, Yeni Demircili, emptied in 1922 by the population exchange, but as known through a number of sources, notably the memoirs of the refugees, was a producer of charcoal, which of course is one of the commodities mentioned, or rather restored, unfortunately, in the Ulamush text. Finally, next to the same village, there is a set of basins cut in the rock, the rocky shore. Here's a very nice image, with this communication with the sea to sluice in seawater, which is clearly a fish tank, and might have been of the type used to keep shellfish for purple producing. One factor that might tilt the balance in favor of Airai is the mention of textiles produced in the smaller city, exported for sale or retailed in the city itself. These exports would fit very well with the situation of Airai here, since it is well connected by sea. Cabotage along the southern side of the peninsula is suggested by the 5th century wreck found off Mount Korikos at Tektash Burnu, laden with a varied cargo, and more long-distance trade is likely simply because of geography and winds, which connect Airai directly with Samos. This geography is very visible during the campaigns of 411 BCE and of 190 BCE in the narrative of Thucydides and of Livy. In the 19th century, the Greek inhabitants of Yeni Demircili and of the region exported not only charcoal, but also contraband tobacco, gunpowder, and firearms to Samos, and indeed further afield. Unfortunate circumstance which drew the attention of the Turkish authorities during the First World War. It's true, and of course in 1922, most of the Demirciliots immigrated to Samos before finally ending up in Athens. We could imagine the export of textiles by sea, the direct sale of textiles to buyers in the context of cabotage or during a festival, like the great festival of Aios Dimitrios at Yeni Demircili during the 19th century. In contrast, an ancient settlement in the admittedly fertile and populous Kızıldağ would have been less connected and more difficult for textile buyers or festival goers. If this city was indeed Airai, a polis for which there's basically no archaeology, 2 inscriptions, and a single bronze coinage from about 350 BCE, we could contextualize the Sinoichism in a precise landscape known by travelers and geographers, and especially thanks to the recent Kladzomenai survey project. There is, of course, a small urban site, which is now, in fact, entirely taken up by beaches, but is known by 19th century and early 20th century travelers. Located on this peninsula, the basins are here, right? These strange rock-cut basins. Here's a particular shot from a guide before the touristification of the site in a Greek travel guide. So there's a small urban site, and beyond which we should look to a territory. We see the polis between its neighbors occupying a number of ecological niches, namely several north-south river valleys, which constitute small agricultural territories separated by elevation. The most important of these valleys stretches above Airai and Demircili, or northwards, occupied by several modern villages. This, of course, is an image from the priceless resource of people shooting footage of their house by drones and posting it on YouTube. This is one example. I wrote to the person who said, of course you can use my drone footage. So there it is. You can see the elevation and this northward valley, right, leading from the sea. Demircili is about here. And the territory has several of these small valleys heading north-south, right? So this particular one is I think, this valley here. There are several other valleys, including one at the eastern edge of the the eastern edge of the coastline. It's actually noticed by Piri Reis. Here, if you actually flip the Piri Reis map, you can see Airai here, Teos here, Korikos with the 2 inlets, quite exaggerated, and here the Herekechai, which is another valley. Here's some more drone footage. You can see the Herekechai and its valley with the sandbar created by the alluviation of that small river. So several small valleys, north-south, leading to plains. This particular plain, which is here, is marked by archaic tumuli, so clearly a frontier zone in the territory of the polis. Between these valleys, a number of hills divided between woods, a mixture of Pinus brutia and oak, maki and garrigue, which represent degraded woodland, and cultivation, mainly olives, hence a village called Yargulad, the oil makers. This area of hills overlooks a fan-shaped plain, which is probably separated between or divided between Kladzomenai and Airai, and has borderland fords, tumuli, and so on. This may be the flat area, the Homalon, mentioned in the arbitration document. In addition, Airai must have held at least part of the mountain, the Korikos, which itself has valleys leading down, torrents leading down to the sea with traces of ancient settlement. There is a plain, the Barbaros plain, which is too far north, probably belongs to Erythrai, but above it a number of, so here's a good view of Korikos, and above the Barbaros plain, a number of settlements, uplands, which probably, again, are part of the territory of Airai. So north-south rivers, hills covered with remains of woods and maki, the mountain itself, the uplands, and probably part of this plain, not very well watered, shared with Kladzomenai. Here is a land use map that shows, for instance, these small agricultural plains, the hills, the large agricultural plain, and then the uplands of Korikos and whatever this frontier zone is here. So here's the territory of Irai, perhaps the city in the Ulamush document. If anyone wants to go cycling their next spring break with Noel and Joe, come and see us during the reception. I'm only partly joking. I mean, this is now a whole area which is full of agro-tourism, Airbnbs, wooden chalets, and so on. So it's actually wineries and so on. So that's just by the by. You can see, therefore, the territory with 3 zones: upper mountainous, middle hilly, and lower plain. A territory of about 160 square kilometers with a much, much smaller proportion of agricultural land and a great resource of pastorally used mountain. So what kind of economy should we see in maybe Irai or maybe a city in the Kızıldağ, in the limestone massif on the other side of the Tails territory? We can guess, rather than Rostovtzeff's cozy picture, at a complex, dynamic reality out of the text from Ulamush, even if this text can only yield incomplete evidence because it only lists tax relief. It will not mention activities which continued to be taxed. It will not mention activities which were not taxed because they didn't take place. And it will not mention activities which were not taxed. So we have a very, very partial picture of things that generated enough income to draw the attention of the taxman. Even this incomplete picture is highly suggestive. So Rostovtzeff is perfectly right to notice the world of the ox, the agrarian economy. Work animals, which surely allow us to posit the whole shebang, fallow, dispersed small plots, the Brodelian triad of grain, wine, and olive, self-consumption, and so on. The inhabitants of the small community protect their oxen from requisition. They also have gardens to supply legumes and pulses. They have a few heads of sheep per household to provide wool for domestic production, manure for the field and the garden, and animal protein in the form of milk and meat. They also have some pigs. All of these grazing happily and peacefully in woodlands. Pigs rooting for acorns from the oaks and sheep grazing in the maquis. These forests themselves supply the raw material for a roster of activities we can reconstruct from traditional forestry. Timber for construction, but also artisanal production. Small wood to be converted into charcoal by flameless consumption, flameless combustion. Deciduous oak and holm oak being particularly suitable, as archaeological evidence, for instance, from Western France shows. Forests and scrublands, of course, support pasturing of ovines and of pigs, but also beekeeping in the scrubland on the edge of the forests. So we see a local economy that is managing a number of overlapping and interlocking claims on resources. It's a diversity which recalls the situation of the Cretan mountains as studied in a classic article by Angelos Chaniotis, who notably points to an archaic inscription mentioning the yearly sorting out of sheep, cattle, and pigs. A wonderful image of the imbrication of the economies. The urban settlement itself probably lived surrounded by animals and productive labor. None of these activities require specialization, rather seasonal rhythms and multiple activities by individuals and households. Yet, even at this level, we see the two instruments that characterize the Greek world from the mid-archaic period onwards: chattel slavery and money. gardens and beehives generate profits. The woodland produces stuff for retail, which requires specialized work by animals, mules, and specialized enslaved workers for the gathering and transport of wood, and the processing of wood into saleable products. A particular type of activity is probably the production of charcoal. The owners of slaves, the enslavers, might be directly involved in this kind of work, as on Phinippos' estate in Athens, or they seem to be allowing the enslaved workers to work independently against a cut of the profits, as the late Hellenistic politician Hibrias of Mylassa probably did in his youth, or they actually rent them out to other citizens, part-timers, who need the extra labor to be able to exploit the woodlands. Sheep and pigs, of course, can yield commodities beyond self-sufficiency: wool, textiles, dairy products, meat, and be sold for cash. Even the ox is caught in the cash economy, since there are extra heads of cattle which are being produced for the market, for the butchers. All of these transactions may have been, so here's a summary of how enslaved labor works in the wood trade, either directly exploited, working on their own, for a cut, or being rented out for a flat fee to part-timers who then exploit the enslaved laborers in one of these ways. All of these transactions presumably explain the bronze coinage struck by Iri, if this is indeed the city we're dealing with, in the mid-4th century BCE. So, interlocking economic constituencies, notably an urban elite which draws rentier income off animals and enslaved labor. The commodities must be traded towards Teos and other cities. If this is Iri, by sea, for instance, Samos. The cash produced by this economy is presumably used to import two things. The first is grain, the grain that the narrow territory of this city cannot produce on its own. Probably from Asia Minor, from the nearby plains of Lydia and Phrygia under royal administration. The second commodity, of course, is a supply of enslaved labor, again from inland Asia Minor or from the constant warfare of the early Hellenistic period. Two commodities which sustain, in turn, the cash-producing economies of our city. So that's one image of already complexified, imbricated economy in our city. But this is not quite the whole story. This picture doesn't convey the dynamism implied by the Urla text. The longest section is devoted to a particular group. Unfortunately, the text is fragmentary and unclear, but it concerns a group which I will call the clothiers, the textile producers, though it is, as we'll see, a somewhat problematic shorthand. They are the people who produce, ergadsdontai, literally work, chlandia and other things, possible restoration, ampechona, out of wool. The text seems to say Milesian wool, rough and fine. Now, Milesian wool, as you all know, is a particular type of fine wool produced by a particular breed of sheep. As the textile historian Dominique Cardon reminds us, the fineness of wool is above all determined by genetics. This passage then seems to mean that there were two grades of Milesian wool, a rough or coarse Milesian wool and a fine Milesian wool. I personally find this somewhat troublesome. I wonder if in fact we're looking at three types of wool: rough wool, soft wool, and Milesian wool. We see specialization to ever finer grades of wool. This is actually not completely easy, but could be possible in the case of this syntax. In any case, what are these people producing? They are producing something called the klandion, a small version of the klanis, a small cloak or shawl described in literary sources as particularly luxurious to the point of suggesting effeminacy when worn by men. It turns up, for instance, the Brauron inventory as something particularly noticeable, and Xenophon singles out the klanis as an item of production, an item of clothing the production of which actually generates considerable wealth. I wonder if the klandion is a short, fine overgarment worn over the chiton by women in Hellenistic statuettes from the mid-4th century BC onwards. The ampechonon, if that's a correct restoration, might be the large-size shawl wrapped around the female body. In any case, some clothiers are specializing in fashionable luxury garments for women. These people, these clothiers, seem to be directly selling themselves their products on the spot or exporting them. They seem to present us with an example of a phenomenon which Claude Aurieux had sought in vain in Egypt, the producteur commerçant, the producer who also commercializes. So we are thinking of products which lead from sheep to shawl, which of course are very well known, shearing or plucking the wool, washing it, regreasing it, spinning it into yarn, weaving it at, of course, the upright warp-weighted loom into standardized pieces. The clothiers require several types of wool and therefore specialized and segregated flocks. I note that at Yemish-le-Boaz, there is a massive but low enclosure of 2 hectares. I wonder if this is somehow connected to, above Irai, to sheep farming, even though this is much larger than the archaeologically attested mandres, or indeed the modern mandres for corals for sheep. So possibly large flocks of sheep being pastured in the mountainous hinterland. Alternatively, they may have been raised across the various ecological niches of our small city with technologies such as coats to protect fine wool from the effect of scrub, a solution which of course has its own costs and solution and problems and needs particular types of expertise. If you like this sort of thing, you can actually try to quantify. Lynn Foxhall, whom I thank very much for saving me from mistakes and helping me in all matters involving sheep, sent this quick sketch, imagining that a Milesian sheep produces 2 to 3 kilograms of wool, which can be spun into 25 kilometers of yarn, enough for 2 to 3 cloaks. If one cloak needs 10 kilometers of yarn, I'm combining Lynn Foxall's figures with Karen Carr's. So her calculation, Lynn Foxall's calculation, are that a flock of 50 fine wool sheep, like that owned by the speaker of Demosthenes 47, could produce 163 cloaks per year. If we, just at random, say that a cloak cost 100 drachmas, perfectly possible, we have cloaks costing up to 300, then a flock of 50 sheep would produce 16,000 drachmas worth of cloaks per year. Completely hypothetical, of course. Equally problematic, and this is really the nub of the matter, is how were these cloaks produced? What is the process that leads from sheep to cloak, from bar to itch? In this case, should we imagine the clothiers owning all the stages of the production in-house? integrating the whole process in a sort of proto-firm, which is an upscaling of domestic production by large households. One argument in favor of this sort of integration would be the need for quality control, as suggested by medieval guild work. Another is the absence of any mention of the taxes on the selling of wool or yarn, be it at fairs or in the marketplace. But of course, that argument is uncertain because of the absence. Any argument from the absence of Rostov taxation is going to be uncertain. If we assume integration, what kind of production? Perhaps based on parallels such as very, very fine loom weights found in the shrine at Metaponto, we could imagine domestic production, just very large households producing in domestic contexts, suggested also by loom weights at Olynthos. We could also perhaps imagine another model by which entrepreneurs own workshops of specialized enslaved laborers, perhaps male, in a radical rupture with the household model, but comparable to urban workshops known from, for instance, classical Athens, for shields or furniture or knives. Lynn Foxall and Peter Acton have disagreed about the feasibility of this model for textiles. Alternatively, at the antipodes of this firm-like model, we could imagine the clothiers as ergastai, retailers, using the terminology by Louis Robert, and not producteurs commerçants at all. They basically would have been purchasing manufactured goods for resale. Clothiers dealing with independent female weavers operating to specs on a cash basis, and perhaps themselves purchasing wool from independent spinners. So not integrated firms, but a whole galaxy of cottage industries on a domestic scale. I've just illustrated two possible schemes for this, integrated models where we have workshop owners controlling the whole process in-house, or, dispersed models in which basically everyone owns a piece of the action and the clothiers are only the people who buy and resell the final product. So I've just sketched some various models of distributed or integrated models of production. In any case, we see an activity which requires labor, skill, capital, and social capital, requiring investment and experimentation, illustrating the insight of Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell that high-value fabrics reconfigure labor, resources, credit, storage, and productive territory. Visible in Mesopotamia, visible, of course, in late Bronze Age Greece. The connection between cloth, wealth, and power. This might explain why, it seems to me explains why, in this text, the clothiers seem to be singled out for special treatment. Let me explain. Whereas all the other tax exemptions are specified in relationship to an activity or to something being taxed, here a specific group of people is granted a sort of blanket exemption of taxes on autus ateles einai, at least at the stage of selling the produce, and I think probably at the stage of production as well. Nor is this all. Theos granted a second round of textile-related exemptions, namely to whatever was being imported. I think this does not mean, say, natron for degreasing or something specifically linked to the production of the cloaks. I think there is a group of clothiers which has to import its own wool to keep up production or expand. Not coals to Newcastle, but wool to pastoral highlands. And there's yet a third group of people who are producing purple, perhaps the same importing wool, perhaps yet another group. Such garments, the purple or decorated with purple bands, garments are well attested in Brauron, in our literary sources for Hellenistic Ionia, and of course the so-called pirate decree of Teos, slightly after this document, in which we see a wide presence of consumption of purple clothing. This, of course, is a well-known set of processes which could have fit very easily in Iri. The relevant shellfish, Hexaplex trunculus and Bolinus brandaris, are endemic to Ionian waters. They might have been stored in the mysterious tanks by the shore, and the seaboard could have provided the space for the processes of heating in vats, dyeing, squeezing out, and air drying in quite simple installation, which are very widespread across the Mediterranean, notably studied by Andrew Wilson at Hesperides. So Teos is granting exemption on various materials for dyeing, and probably especially on the shellfish themselves. This has been argued by Ephraim Lytle for the porphyra. This is a tax on the purple shells. The 1st century CE Lex Portoria Provinciae Asiae, which preserved Hellenistic practices, gives the game away. The tax on the shellfish is paid not by the seller, but by hochromenos, the buyer who's about to use them, because of course they will benefit from enormous profits. So we see here a separate group or groups of clothiers chasing growth and returns by importing wool and aiming for luxury products, namely purple. These choices might reflect pressures and threats, the physical unavailability or political unfeasibility of finding ever-increasing pasture for the Milesian sheep within a narrow agrarian territory, the unreliable results or unbearable costs of pasturing fine sheep in mountain scrub, and perhaps the difficulty of quality control according to whatever production mode we adopt. So in spite of the uncertainties about the chaîne opératoire, I think we can reconstruct a sort of ghostly history of sheep and cloaks, sheep and shawls in the area. Originally, domestic production of wool and clothing. Then, accessory production for the market in household. Next, the leap to production for the market, focusing on profitable products and specializing in various grades of fine textile and luxury clothing. At the end of our story, some clothiers have to import wool to keep up production and have decided to specialize in purple to pursue higher margins, to seek differentiation, or to palliate problems in supply and production. Perhaps these processes mirror on a small scale what might have happened in a large textile center like Miletus itself. We see perhaps an illustration of Peter Acton's thesis that differentiation is a main means to increase profits in the ancient economy. The wood trade, however, might be the atlas bearing the greatest load in the local economy. If the specific resource of this community is timber, perhaps a combination of Pinus brutia and deciduous oaks, I'm wondering if the timber trade first gave the necessary connectivities on which the wool trade is piggybacking. So the Ulamush text shows us not just a complex economy, but a stratified yet dynamic one, which we see evolving before our eyes in this document as part of a regional and perhaps supra-regional network. The document preserves a structure of its own, which must reflect the structure of negotiation, the sequence of negotiation between Teos and the small community. The elites get protected by liturgies. The whole population gets protected from personal taxation. Then certain elements of the local complex local economy are negotiated. The rentier class, which uses enslaved labor and animal power. And finally, the clothiers, who manage to cut out a special deal for themselves, which in turn may have triggered the tax exemption for everyone in the community to try to alleviate social tension. So, probably especially necessary if the clothiers are a sector, a runaway sector in expansion, putting pressure on resources. So that's my hypothetical reconstruction of what's going on in this community. Just a few questions before I end. Or rather some further questions. The first is to return to the paper I originally wrote, which is, what is the relationship between autonomy, fiscality, and a complex economy with a runaway textile sector? Sorry. The second question is that about the social history of Synoikism. Theos is lifting taxation for 10 years on a number of sectors and elite actors in the community. Should we interpret this optimistically, saying that basically this is creating a tide lifting all boats? Or are we, on the contrary, seeing the rise of economic clout and in the absence of local institutions which might restrain it? It's true that after 10 years, the local elite running amok is going to be brought back fattened in the fold of liturgies. What happens in the meantime to the local demos and local public goods? Does Synoikism paradoxically act as a punctual dioikism by removing local democratic restraints on elites? A parallel for this phenomenon might be the case of Pescia in Tuscany, absorbed by Florence and plugged into bigger networks which allow for runaway growth by its local elites. A simpler way of asking the question is that of sustainability and the risk of the tragedy of the commons in view of the special treatment of the clothiers. I've just given you a quote here, which I won't read, by J.M. Frayne on how fine wool really needs good pasture of the type produced by either cutting down forests or taking away arable land. The first is the main resource of this community, and the second is probably in short notice. That is a real question of capitalism and sustainability in our city. Third question is whether we could read this document against the grain and give a radical history of enslaved workers, household women, social disruption, competition, and exclusion. Is this possible? I think it might be possible to read this document this way, especially if you look at the resources of paroemiography and modern Greek literature from Western Asia Minor, such as Venezis' beloved Eolikii. This is again something which I would like to try during the seminar. Fourth area of inquiry is, of course, economic history and how to fit this microeconomic history within much broader regional phenomena of consumption and expenditure, which we know a little bit about, notably about indebtedness in Theos just at this point, because we have another document, the so-called Pirate Decree, in which the city of Theos responded to a crisis by an enforced loan, which is like an X-ray of the local financial settlement. To read these two things together, and even on a broader scale, to look at the Hellenistic economy before the rise of the Ptolemaic dominance. Final question, of course, is about the nature of the ancient economy. My model here is, of course, recognizably that of our friend Alain Bresson, in which even the smallest community is deeply enmeshed within the market. Agrarian activities, timber-related activities, and the third parasitical but dynamic level of the clothiers. The interesting thing here is that if these clothes are produced in ergasteria, they raise a very interesting question, that of whether the ancient ergasterion necessarily reverts to the rentier, as Max Weber suggested, or whether it's capable of growth like the modern firm or the medieval, medieval association or corporation, something which Moses Finlay would have found horrifying. Max Weber, in his Agrarverhältnisse, wrote about this problem. The Ergasterion is not the modern firm. It would be interesting to interrogate that statement in light of this inscription. When Max Weber's health was failing, he actually thought of entrusting the revision of the 4th edition of the Agrarverhältnisse to none other than Rostovtzeff in 1920. The plan fell through because Rostovtzeff, of course, was nowhere to be found. At that point, he was, in fact, on his westward journey, stopping briefly in Oxford, where he was a member of Common Room in my former Oxford College, Corpus Christi. It would have been very interesting to see what Rostovtzeff would have done with the Urla document if he had used it within an argumentative theoretical essay rather than as a throwaway, fond example in the narrative panorama of the social and economic history. Thank you very much.
At the end. I think we have a reprieve. I think we can take a few questions here now if there are any from the audience. There must be questions, comments.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm curious if you think this exception of the physician tax points to urban density of public physician on hand. What are your thoughts on that?
So the iatrikon, I hesitate to speak about Ptolemaic indirect taxation with Joe Manning in the room, but it probably is not a tax on doctors, but tax to pay for a doctor. We agree on that.
And does that suggest a lot of a density of people to have that mechanism?
I don't know. I suppose it's a doctor in Teos itself. I also suppose the doctor serves not just the urban settlement, but the whole territory, including outlying places like Iri. I do find it interesting that whoever are allowed in are exempted any other taxes, but medical care, health care is not exempted, must be paid for. You have to pay your contributions, which I thought is very interesting. I don't know. I don't know if it's more than one doctor. I suspect it's just a retainer for one doctor, in effect. And the issue that doctors are a rare commodity that has to be retained by retainers like Democedes himself in the Herodotus narrative, right? So I think that's what's going on. Yes, it's an interesting point of the social utility of that tax.
John, can I ask a quick one? You were kind of skirting, you didn't mention Xenon Archive or Xenon, but it seems like it's a logical analog with Carians coming into Egypt, like Xenon running this estate, complete with my Milesian sheep.
Yep. Yeah.
Are you tempted by that, or do you think your model is different enough?
Yes. I had not thought of using the Zeno's Milesian ship as an actual parallel rather than a place to fish for examples. But yes, what if we are looking at, in fact, in both cases, the same idea, which is development, increase your margins at any way possible. And one way is clearly get better stock. And therefore, we don't have Apollonius, the visionary entrepreneur. We just have good old Anatolian know-how.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Kaunos. After all, Miletus has this hinterland of sheep. Iassos has this place. And we know if there's money to be made, let's get better sheep. And so this is nice. And that actually bridges this early and high Hellenistic in a nice way, I think. Yeah.
This sources, later sources talk a lot about the saffron that was produced there as a dye and as a perfume. And I didn't see any reference to that production coming into the discussion.
Is that not the Kilikian Korikos, though?
There's Korykian.
Yes, I think it's not this one.
It's a different one. Okay.
It's a different one.
But
Yes,
it's also sort of
it's a different one. I don't think there's saffron there, though. I may be surprised. You know, I have not been. There is you know, the proverbs, to give the story away about what I'd like to talk about tomorrow, the proverbs about Korikos and Strabo as a land of bad men, I think is extremely interesting if we have a economy of valuable sheep across the landscape. I think the militarization of this landscape has to do not just with autonomy, but with sheep. So everything is explainable through sheep. You know, this is the takeaway point. No, yeah.
Thanks so much, John. This is so rich, and I have a lot of questions. But the one I want to start with, though, is the one at the beginning of your inscription, in the first few extant lines, where he talks about them being Atabesun Koregion,
Yep.
and something or other, Koregion, Atapadakion, and then in oxen. Those things seem to me to kind of stand apart. You didn't talk very much about them. Not sure what Boegion would be, but all these things seem to be sort of ritual or festival kinds of things. And you mentioned something about corvée, you know, oxen corvée.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if all these things aren't related to something at the beginning, exempting them not so much from money taxes, rather from the obligation to participate and provide for festivals.
Yeah. No, of course. The interesting thing in this document is that taxation changes under your eyes, you know, of different types, and that's interesting that I think it's actually grouped by category. So yes, the first thing must be that the elite negotiating this thing has said, well, we want to be kept free of all of these burdensome things. So you're a big polis, we're a small polis. As soon as we join you, we're going to be hit with being DGS and DUS, and you know, we will be hit with Munera, and they don't want that. They absolutely do not want to provide a free oxen because, you know, we're a small city and so on. You know, it's what in Roman time you call scepe. You know, you want to be protected from this kind of thing. So yes, that itself is really, really interesting. That the elite immediately senses a rat and wants to preserve itself from that. Yeah, the idea also that the city of Teos just is basically, it doesn't use levy taxes to hire oxen. It just says, okay, we're taking your oxen to carry blocks, presumably for the theater and the fortifications that are going up at this time. It actually just taxes prosperous farmers and just grabs their oxen for a while. And that's remarkable, I think, you know, that to see that polis could levy corvée labor. Of course, there is.
Could that be in a cabinet survival?
Yeah. I'm wondering about that. That's one thing I'm wondering. Yeah, but of course, it's Cleobis and Biton, right? I think the mother has to be carried to the city on an ox chariot, but it's not quite the same than this, which is Epidaurus doesn't do it. Epidaurus actually just pays contractors, but here they prefer to take oxen. Eudemos of Plataea, he actually provides 6,000 ox days. But that means that usually people don't provide ox days for free. Right? It's super interesting, I think so. Greetings.
Hello. Me? Good morning. Hi. Thank you so much. This has been super fascinating. And you've started to kind of move towards what I wanted to ask already in the answer that you've just been giving to Noel, which was to think about the moment of the Synoikia, of the joining together of these two cities, and how the taxation that's put down here in this inscription relates to that sort of social moment of the joining of these two cities together. And I was thinking about power dynamics between them as to who is calling the shots as to which tax exemptions are made for who and why.
Yes. No, I think that's a really great question about the social history of Synoikia. And we should talk about it tomorrow, right? basically because you can have a small number of sheep without being exempt from tax. But if you have more than that, then it gets taxed. But if you're producing clothes, then you're not taxed. So it seems that there's very small imbalances in this that probably have a big effect. I think we should read it and try to game it out. We need a tax lawyer to come and help us to figure this out, right? I think it's a very good question about elite power versus, what the polis normally does is to protect the commons. Now there's no polis. You have rich people who are exempt of all these taxes, and the polis is now across the bay. What effect did that have locally? Locally we're told that Synoikism increases democracy, Dioikism diminishes it. But here, I wonder if Synoikism does in fact, the price to pay is 10 years of elite local power. And everyone is just willing to put up with that for a reason. I'm not sure why. Yeah?
I look forward to that discussion tomorrow.
There's something I'd like to talk about. I don't have the answer yet. It's something we should just game out, as it were. Yeah, absolutely. Knowing that this is the only document we have, right? So we'll have to be hypothetical and inventive.
Please join us over at the Unique Club, and we'll toast John there. Thanks, John.